The tired girl couldn't see if anyone noticed, but she made the signal anyway. Thumb tucked beneath 4 fingers, the international rescue gesture, silent, desperate, calculated. Sarah Garcia's sightless eyes stared forward at 35,000 feet, and she prayed that anyone would understand. 3 rows back, Armand Piero's stomach dropped like a stone, not just because of the signal itself. He'd seen it before in his world of shadows and violence, but because he recognized the man beside her. Benjamin. Expensive suit, possessive grip on her wrist, Armand's own trafficking capo, completely unaware his boss was on this flight. First-class cabin. Flight 447, somewhere over Kansas. Sarah in 3B, white cane folded beside her, wearing a faded gray sweater that looked like it had seen better days. Benjamin in 3C, relaxed and confident, thinking he'd gotten away with it. Armand's hands clenched the armrest as his blood turned to ice. That's my man. I enabled this. Armand Piero had spent 38 years perfecting the art of not feeling anything. It was a survival skill in his world, the kind of skill that kept you breathing when everyone else around you stopped. So, when he settled into seat 6A of Flight 447, first class, bourbon in hand, his mind was exactly where it needed to be, on shipping manifests, territory disputes, and the 3 distributors in Los Angeles who thought they could renegotiate terms. They couldn't. They wouldn't. He'd made that crystal clear during his last-minute business meeting at a warehouse in Long Beach. The kind of meeting where words were chosen carefully and consequences were implied with surgical precision. The flight attendant smiled as she passed, offering him a warm towel. He declined with a slight shake of his head. His phone buzzed with updates from his second-in-command about a delayed shipment of counterfeit electronics. Standard problems, fixable problems, the kind of problems that kept an empire running smoothly without unnecessary bloodshed. Then he saw it. 3 rows ahead. A young woman with dark hair pulled into a simple ponytail, her white cane folded neatly against the window beside her. She sat unnaturally still. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace, it was survival. Her hand rose slowly from her lap, fingers positioning themselves with deliberate, calculated precision, thumb tucked beneath 4 fingers. Armand's bourbon glass stopped halfway to his lips. The international rescue gesture. His blood turned to absolute ice. Not here. Not on a goddamn airplane at 35,000 feet where exits were sealed and options were suffocating and everyone was trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky. Then his eyes shifted to the man beside her, and his entire world tilted off its axis. Benjamin. Broad shoulders filling out an expensive designer suit that Armand's money had probably paid for. The faint edge of a neck tattoo barely visible above his collar, a scorpion. Armand knew, though he couldn't see it from this angle. Benjamin, who'd been with the organization for 3 years. Benjamin, who Armand had personally promoted 18 months ago to handle special routes, because he was efficient, discreet, and ruthlessly competent at moving product across state lines without attracting federal attention. Benjamin, who had his hand wrapped around the blind girl's wrist like she was cargo. Armand's chest was constricted. He set his bourbon down slowly, carefully, his hand remarkably steady despite the freight train currently demolishing his internal organs. The girl's sightless eyes stared forward at nothing and everything. She couldn't see if anyone had noticed, couldn't see if her desperate, silent plea had registered with a single soul on this aircraft. Her lips pressed together, trembling slightly, and then her hand rose again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if she was giving the universe one more chance. Thumb tucked beneath 4 fingers. Please, someone, anyone. Armand watched Benjamin lean close to her, his mouth near her ear, whispering something that made the girl's entire body go rigid. Her jaw clenched. Her free hand gripped the armrest until her knuckles went white, and then, with what looked like the last reserves of her courage, she formed the signal a 3rd time, more desperate now. Trembling, breaking. Armand's throat tightened. She's blind. She's signaling for help. And the man beside her works for me, and that man has absolutely no clue I'm sitting 3 rows behind him watching this entire nightmare unfold. The realization hit him like a freight train, doing 90 miles an hour straight through his chest. I created this. I gave Benjamin the power, the roots, the protection, the resources, the implicit permission to operate in the shadows of my empire, where I didn't ask too many questions because plausible deniability kept everyone safer. I looked away. I drew my little moral lines in the sand. Contraband, yes. People, no. And I actually believed those lines meant something. I actually believed I was better than the monsters. And now fate had put him 3 rows behind to watch the consequences of his willful blindness. His eyes tracked the details with the cold precision of a man trained to read situations, to assess threats, to identify weaknesses. The girl's shoes were worn at the heels, the kind of worn that spoke of long miles and limited options. Her gray sweater had been washed so many times the fabric looked thin and faded, pilling at the elbows. She clutched a small backpack against her chest, like it contained everything she owned in the world. Maybe it did. She looked like someone who'd been told lies and believed them. Someone who'd trusted the wrong person. Someone who'd walked willingly into a nightmare because she thought she was walking toward hope. Benjamin, meanwhile, checked his phone with the casual ease of a man who thought he'd gotten away with it. His posture was relaxed, confident. He scrolled through messages, his thumb moving lazily across the screen. He ordered a scotch when the flight attendant passed. He even smiled at her. All charm and expensive suits, and the kind of polished veneer that made people think successful businessman instead of predator. He had no idea, no earthly idea that Armand Piero, the most dangerous man in the Eastern Syndicate, the man whose name made federal prosecutors nervous and rival organizations careful, was sitting 3 rows behind him, watching every single move. Armand's hands rested on his armrests, fingers curled slightly, tendons tight. His face remained perfectly neutral, the mask he'd worn for decades firmly in place, but inside, something was cracking. Something fundamental. Something he'd built carefully over 20 years of surviving in a world where emotion was liability and hesitation was a death sentence. Because that girl Sarah, he'd later learn her name was Sarah Garcia, that girl had just performed a silent act of desperate courage that most people couldn't manage if they tried. She'd made that signal knowing she couldn't see if anyone was watching, knowing she might be sealing her own fate, knowing the man beside her could snap her wrist or worse if he realized what she was doing. And she'd done it anyway. 3 times. Armand's jaw tightened. He forced himself to breathe normally, to maintain the appearance of a bored businessman checking his own phone. But his mind was racing through scenarios with the cold calculation of someone who'd orchestrated operations across 6 states. The airplane was contained, trapped, which meant so was Benjamin, which meant so was the girl, which meant Armand had a narrow window to intervene without causing panic, without alerting Benjamin, without turning this flight into a scene that would bring federal heat down on everyone involved. He watched Benjamin whisper something else to Sarah, watched her body go even more rigid if that was possible, watched her fingers twitch like she wanted to make the signal again, but was too terrified. And Armand made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire life. He caught the eye of a flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes named Claire, according to her name tag. He gestured subtly, and she approached with professional courtesy. "Yes, sir? Can I get you anything?" Armand's voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that made people listen without understanding why. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it exactly as I say without asking questions. Can you do that?" Claire hesitated, her smile faltering slightly. Something in Armand's eyes made her nod. "Good." He pulled out his wallet, extracted 5 crisp $100 bills, and tucked them discreetly into her hand along with a folded note. "The blind woman in seat 3B, 3 rows ahead. Give this to her during your next beverage pass. Put it directly in her hand. Make sure the man beside her doesn't see. Act completely natural. Can you do that?" Claire glanced at the money, then at the note, then at Armand's face. Whatever she saw there made her swallow hard and nod again. "Yes, sir. Good girl." Armand's voice dropped even lower. "And Claire? That woman's life depends on you doing this right. So don't disappoint me." Claire's face went pale, but she nodded and moved away with the money and note tucked carefully against her serving tray. Armand sat back, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He watched Benjamin check his phone again, completely oblivious. Watched Sarah sit frozen in her seat, her hand no longer making the signal but her entire body screaming distress to anyone who knew how to look. And Armand thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, this is it. This is the moment. The girl who can't see just forced the man who refused to look to finally open his eyes. Benjamin had no idea the reckoning was 3 rows behind him, watching, waiting, and absolutely done looking away. Where are you watching from? Kindly drop your city in the comments and please subscribe as we all get to see how Armand handles this nightmare. Thank you. Armand's mind moved through scenarios with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd spent 2 decades calculating risk versus reward in situations where mistakes meant body bags. Storm down the aisle right now? Impossible. Too many witnesses with phones and that uniquely American instinct to record everything. The confined space worked against aggressive intervention seats too close together. Passengers packed in. No room to maneuver without causing exactly the kind of scene that would have air marshals involved and federal questions asked. And Benjamin was armed. Armand had personally approved the concealed carry permit Benjamin used for security purposes during transport operations. The irony tasted like battery acid on his tongue. No, this required precision, strategy, the kind of cold, calculated extraction that kept everyone breathing and Benjamin completely unaware he'd been caught until it was far too late for him to do anything about it. Armand had already flagged Claire, already passed her the money and the note, already watched her face go pale with the weight of what he'd asked her to do. Now he waited, every muscle in his body coiled tight beneath his perfectly calm exterior, as she made her way down the aisle with the beverage cart. He'd written the note in Braille. It was a skill he'd acquired 7 years ago when a blind informant named Thomas had fed him information about a rival organization's smuggling operation through the port. Thomas had been useful, loyal, and ultimately expendable when the operation concluded. But Armand had learned Braille in those 6 months because information came in many forms and he refused to be limited by something as mundane as inability to read dots on paper. He'd never imagined he'd use that skill for something like this. The note had been simple, direct, carefully worded to inspire hope without triggering panic. You are not alone. If you are being held against your will, ask to use the bathroom in 5 minutes. I will help you. Someone is watching. A. P. He debated the signature. Debated whether identifying himself even with initials was wise. But the girl needed something concrete to hold on to. Some small anchor of credibility in a world that had clearly taught her that trust was a weapon used against her. Claire reached row 3. Armand watched with the focused intensity of a man watching a bomb disposal, which in a sense, this was. One wrong move and Benjamin would realize something was off. One wrong move and Sarah would be in immediate, escalated danger. One wrong move and this entire aircraft became a crime scene at 35,000 feet. Can I get you anything? Claire's voice was remarkably steady given the $500 and a lifetime of nightmares currently tucked against her serving tray. Benjamin ordered a scotch. Neat. Of course he did. Confident. Relaxed. Completely unaware his entire world was about to collapse. And for you, miss? Claire turned to Sarah with practiced courtesy. Just water, please. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Small and careful, like she'd learned that taking up too much space had consequences. Claire poured the water with hands that only trembled slightly. As she handed Sarah the plastic cup, she pressed something else into the girl's palm, something small and folded, tucked cleverly against the napkin in a way that looked completely natural, unless you were specifically watching for it. Benjamin didn't even glance over. He was scrolling through his phone, scotch in hand, the picture of a businessman on a routine flight. Armand watched Sarah's fingers close around the note. Watched her face remain carefully neutral, even as her thumb traced across the surface, and found the raised dots. Her breath caught such a small sound, barely audible over the aircraft engines, but Armand heard it, saw the way her shoulders tensed, saw hope and terror war across her face in equal measure. She traced the dots again, slower this time, as if confirming what she'd read, as if convincing herself this wasn't some cruel trick her desperate mind had conjured. Armand checked his watch. 5 minutes. He'd given her 5 minutes to process, to decide, to find whatever courage she had left. The seconds crawled past like hours. Benjamin finished his scotch and ordered another. He typed out a text message, smiling slightly at whatever response he received, probably coordinating the pickup at the destination airport, probably confirming the location where he planned to deliver Sarah like she was a package, a commodity, a thing, instead of a human being who'd been betrayed by her own blood. Armand's jaw tightened. 4 minutes. 3. At exactly 5 minutes, Sarah's voice cut through the ambient noise of the cabin, barely audible, cracking with fear, but steady enough. Excuse me, I need to use the restroom. Benjamin's hand immediately tightened on her wrist. Armand saw Sarah wince, saw her bite her lip to keep from crying out. You went before we boarded. Benjamin's voice was low, controlled, but edged with irritation and suspicion. Sarah's voice cracked, and for a terrible moment Armand thought she'd break, thought she'd give up, thought the fear would swallow her whole. But then she pulled herself together with visible effort and said, "Please, I have a bladder condition. I need to go now." Beautiful. Brilliant. The kind of detail that was embarrassing enough that most men wouldn't push. Medical enough that it couldn't be easily dismissed. Benjamin's eyes narrowed. He clearly didn't like this deviation from whatever script he'd established. His grip on her wrist remained tight for another few seconds, a test, Armand realized, to see if she'd back down before he reluctantly released her. But as Sarah started to stand, Benjamin rose with her. Armand's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket before he forced it to stop. Not yet, not yet. Then Claire appeared like an angel of perfectly timed intervention, her voice bright with professional courtesy. "Sir, I'm sorry, but only one person can be in the aisle during turbulence. FAA regulations. For safety. I'll be happy to escort her." Benjamin's face darkened. "There's no turbulence." Claire's smile never wavered. "Captain announced we might experience some shortly. Regulations require us to minimize aisle traffic. I'll make sure she gets there safely and returns to her seat. It'll just be a moment." The genius of it was that Benjamin couldn't argue without drawing attention, couldn't insist on accompanying her without looking like exactly what he was, a controlling predator who didn't trust his victim out of arm's reach, especially not with other passengers starting to glance over, wondering what the holdup was. Benjamin sat back down with visible reluctance, his jaw tight with frustration. "Make it quick." "Of course, sir." Claire took Sarah's arm gently and guided her into the aisle. Armand watched Benjamin's face as Sarah moved away, watched him track her movement with the cold assessment of someone calculating risk. Benjamin's hand moved to his phone, fingers hovering over the screen like he was considering making a call, sending a warning, activating whatever backup plan he had. Then the moment passed. Benjamin set his phone down and stared out the window, his body language radiating impatience but not alarm. He still had no earthly idea that Armand Piero was sitting 3 rows behind him, watching every micro-expression, reading every tell, and planning exactly how this was going to end. Sarah moved down the aisle with her white cane tapping softly against the carpet, Claire's hand lightly guiding her elbow. Armand counted to 10 long enough that it wouldn't look suspicious, short enough that he'd reach the galley before Benjamin's paranoia overrode his false sense of security. Then he stood. He moved with the casual ease of someone simply stretching their legs on a long flight, retrieving something from the overhead bin. A businessman attending to mundane business. Nothing to see here. He walked past Benjamin's row without a glance. Benjamin didn't look up from his phone. Armand continued toward the back of the aircraft, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since his first operation 20 years ago. The back galley was small, cramped, surrounded by beverage carts and emergency equipment, and the narrow door to the lavatory. Sarah stood near the galley entrance, Claire beside her, both women radiating tension. Armand stepped into the small space and closed the curtain behind him with deliberate care. Sarah's head turned toward the sound of his movement, her sightless eyes tracking toward him with eerie accuracy. Her entire body was trembling. Her hand gripped her cane so tightly her knuckles had gone bone white. Claire looked at Armand with terrified question in her eyes. "Now what?" Armand's voice, when he spoke, was low and impossibly gentle, a tone he didn't know he still possessed. A tone that came from some buried part of himself he'd thought dead and buried. "Sarah, my name is Armand. You're safe now. I saw your signal. I saw what that man is doing, and I'm going to help you. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Sarah's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Tears streamed down her face, silent and devastating. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Then, finally, in a voice so broken it physically hurt to hear, "You saw me? You actually saw me?" Armand's throat tightened. "I saw you, Sarah. I see you. And that man in 3C? He's about to learn what happens when someone finally looks." Sarah reached the back galley, trembling so violently that Claire had to steady her against the beverage cart. The small space smelled like coffee and recycled air, and the particular kind of fear that came from being trapped at 35,000 feet with nowhere to run. Armand stepped in behind them, his body blocking the narrow entrance, and pulled the curtain closed with deliberate care. The fabric barrier was thin, flimsy, but it created the illusion of privacy in a space where privacy was a luxury none of them could actually afford. Claire looked at Armand with wide, terrified eyes, silently asking what she was supposed to do now. "Stay here," Armand said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people obey without question. Stand by that curtain. If anyone tries to come back here, you delay them. You understand? Claire nodded mutely. Armand turned his full attention to Sarah, and his voice, that voice that could make grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit, that voice that had ordered operations across 6 states without a tremor, softened into something he didn't recognize as his own. Sarah, my name is Armand. You made the rescue signal. I saw it. And I need you to answer one question honestly, and then I promise you, I'm going to fix this. Are you being held against your will? Sarah's knees buckled, just completely gave out. Armand caught her before she hit the floor, guiding her to lean against the galley counter because there was nowhere to sit, nowhere to collapse, nowhere to break down in the way her body desperately needed to. Tears streamed down her face, silent, devastating. The kind of tears that came from a place so deep that sound couldn't reach it. Yes. The word tore out of her like something physical, like she was expelling poison from her system. God, yes, he said. Her voice cracked, splintered. He said if I caused a scene, if I tried to signal anyone, if I did anything except sit quietly, he'd end me. Right there, on the plane. He said no one would believe a blind girl over a man in a designer suit. He said I was easy. That's the word he used. Easy. Armand's rage was a living thing inside his chest, clawing at his ribcage, demanding release. Every instinct he'd honed over 20 years screamed at him to walk back out there and solve this problem, the way he'd solved 100 others, quickly, efficiently, permanently. But he forced himself to stay still, to keep his voice gentle, to be the person this girl needed, instead of the monster he actually was. The man in 3C, Armand said, his hand steady even though his pulse was hammering. His name is Benjamin. I need you to tell me how he got you. Start from the beginning. Sarah's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her fingers found the edge of the counter and gripped it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. My uncle, Miguel Garcia, he was the only family I had left after my parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. Her voice was hollow, mechanical, like she was reading from a script written in her nightmares. 2 weeks ago, he told me we were moving to Seattle. He said his friend knew someone at a nonprofit for visually impaired adults. He said they had a job for me. Real work, good pay, a chance to be independent, a fresh start. She laughed, and the sound was so broken it made Armand's chest physically hurt. Greener pastures. That's what he kept saying. Greener pastures, mija. A better life. Her voice cracked completely, shattered into pieces. I trusted him. He was all I had left in the world. My parents left me with him. He took care of me, fed me, put a roof over my head. I actually thought he loved me. Sarah, Armand started, but she kept going, the words pouring out now like a dam had broken. He sold me. The words were flat, dead, final. For money. Miguel sold me like I was furniture he didn't need anymore. Benjamin picked me up at the bus station last Tuesday morning. Miguel told me Benjamin was the friend, the contact, the person who'd take me to Seattle. Benjamin was nice at first, professional. He had paperwork, contracts, employment documents all written in Braille, perfect Braille, official looking. He said the nonprofit required medical documentation, background checks. That's why we had to go through so many steps. Sarah's sightless eyes stared forward, seeing something far worse than darkness. By the time I realized something was wrong, we were already at the airport. He'd taken my phone, said it was policy the nonprofit provided phones, work devices. Everything would be given to me when we arrived. He kept his hand on my wrist the entire time. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough that I knew I couldn't run even if I tried. Armand felt something inside him shatter. Not crack, not break, shatter. Into so many pieces he wasn't sure they could ever be reassembled into anything resembling human. Your uncle sold you, he repeated, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears, distant, hollow, like it was coming from underwater. Sarah nodded, her whole body shaking. Benjamin laughed about it yesterday. We were in a hotel room near LAX. He thought I was asleep. I heard him on the phone. He said Miguel got $15,000. He said my uncle told him I was perfect for this blind. No close friends, no job, no community ties, no one who'd look too hard if I disappeared. He said Miguel even provided my medical records to prove I was blind, like that was a selling point. Armand's hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white. The rage inside him wasn't hot anymore, it was cold, surgical. the kind of cold that made empires fall and problems disappear. What was Benjamin's plan when you landed? Sarah's whisper was so broken it was barely audible over the engine noise. A house. Somewhere outside Kansas City. He said there were other girls already there. He said I'd work off my debt, the cost of transportation, housing, the paperwork Miguel needed to surrender custody since I'm legally disabled. He said it would take years, maybe a decade. He said I'd never leave because where would a blind girl go? How would I survive? Who would believe me? She sobbed once. A sound ripped from somewhere primal. He showed me the address in Braille. Pressed the paper into my hand so I could read it. He wanted me to know he'd planned everything. Wanted me to know how powerless I was. How thoroughly trapped. Armand knelt in the cramped galley, the floor hard against his knees, his expensive suit wrinkling against metal and linoleum. He was eye level with Sarah now, even though she couldn't see him, and his voice cracked in a way it hadn't in 2 decades. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. I'm going to stop him. Your uncle Miguel, he will pay for what he did. Benjamin will pay. They will both pay in ways that will make them beg for mercy. They will never receive. But right now, right here, I need you to trust me. I know that's asking the impossible. I know trust is what got you on this plane. But I'm asking anyway. Can you do that? Sarah's hand reached out blindly, searching. Armand took it without hesitation. Her fingers were small, cold, trembling. They gripped his hand with desperate strength. You saw, she whispered, and there was wonder beneath the terror, beneath the trauma, beneath everything broken. You actually saw me. I couldn't see if anyone was looking. I couldn't see if the signal meant anything. But you saw. Armand's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. I see you, Sarah. I see you, and I'm so goddamn sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry I wasn't looking sooner. I'm sorry for everything that led to this moment. Who are you? Sarah asked, and there was something in her voice, not suspicion exactly, but awareness that this man kneeling in an airplane galley, speaking with authority that didn't come from being a good Samaritan, was something else entirely. Armand could have lied, should have lied. But something about this girl, this moment, this reckoning demanded truth. I'm someone who operates in the shadows of the world you're not supposed to see. I'm someone who makes problems disappear. And Sarah, his voice dropped to something lethal, something that made even Claire flinch. Benjamin works for me. The routes he uses, the protection he operates under, the resources that made him confident enough to traffic human beings across state lines, those all belong to me. Sarah's hand tightened on his. She didn't pull away, didn't recoil. He doesn't know you're here, does he? She asked quietly. No. Armand's smile was sharp enough to cut. Benjamin has no idea that his boss has been sitting 3 rows behind him, watching him commit his final mistake. He thinks he's gotten away with it. He thinks he's safe. He thinks he's untouchable because he works for the most feared man in the Eastern Syndicate. Armand stood, his decision made, his path clear. He's about to learn that being untouchable only works until the moment it doesn't. Stay here with Claire. Lock the lavatory door if you need to, but don't go back out there. Not yet. What are you going to do? Sarah's voice was small. Armand's voice was colder than death itself. I'm going to have a conversation with Benjamin about career changes and life expectancy. And Sarah, when you hear me ask him questions, when you hear him answer, that's for you. That's so you know exactly who enabled what happened to you. So you know the truth costs something. He turned to Claire. No one comes back here. I don't care if the captain himself asks. No one. Claire nodded, her face pale but resolute. Armand pulled back the curtain and stepped into the aisle. 3 rows ahead, Benjamin sat in his seat, scrolling through his phone, completely relaxed, completely unaware. Not for much longer. Armand sent Sarah to the crew rest area with Claire and another flight attendant named Monica, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know when to ask questions and when to pee. Simply act. He instructed them with absolute clarity. Lock the door from the inside. Open it for no one except him. And if Benjamin somehow made it past Armand and tried to get to Sarah, they were to scream loud enough to wake the dead and bring every passenger on this aircraft running. Claire looked like she wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Monica just nodded once, her hand already on Sarah's elbow, guiding the trembling girl toward safety. Armand watched them disappear behind the crew rest door, heard the lock click into place, and felt something settle in his chest. Sarah was secure, protected, which meant he could now focus on the problem 3 rows ahead without distraction, without hesitation, without a single shred of mercy. He walked back down the aisle with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world. His face was a mask of deadly calm, the same face he wore during negotiations that ended with people signing over territory, the same face he wore when delivering consequences for betrayal. Other passengers glanced up briefly and then looked away, some instinct telling them this was not a man to make eye contact with. He stopped beside Benjamin's seat, row 3C. The leather still warm from where Sarah had been sitting minutes ago, her terror soaked into the fabric. "Benjamin." His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "Galley. Now." Benjamin looked up from his phone with casual disinterest, probably expecting a flight attendant or another passenger asking to squeeze past. Then his eyes focused on Armand's face. The color drained from Benjamin's skin so fast it was almost comical. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. "Boss?" The word came out strangled, confused, edged with the first tendrils of real fear. What are you doing on this flight?" Armand's smile was a knife wrapped in silk. "Funny. I was about to ask you the same question. Galley. Now, don't make me say it a third time." Benjamin stood on legs that visibly shook. His hand moved toward his jacket, toward the weapon Armand knew was holstered there, then froze when Armand's eyes went flat and dead. The message was clear. Don't even think about it. Other passengers were starting to notice now. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, frowning slightly. An elderly woman 2 rows back watched with open curiosity. Benjamin walked toward the galley like a man walking toward his own execution, which in a sense, he was. Armand followed 3 steps behind, close enough to react if Benjamin tried anything stupid, far enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. They reached the back galley. The same cramped space where Sarah had broken apart minutes ago, where truth had been spoken and promises made. Armand stepped in behind Benjamin and pulled the curtain closed with deliberate care. The small space suddenly felt suffocating, claustrophobic, perfect. Benjamin's back was against the beverage cart, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling visibly now. He tried for a smile, some semblance of the confident capo who'd boarded this flight thinking he was untouchable. It failed spectacularly. "Boss, I didn't know you were on this flight. This is just a routine transport. I was handling some business in LA and..." Armand's voice cut through the stammering like a blade through tissue. Lethal, precise, absolute. "The blind girl, Sarah Garcia. Seat 3B. Tell me what you were planning." Benjamin's face went white as snow. Not pale. White. The color of someone who just realized the ground had disappeared beneath their feet and they were already falling. "Boss. I can explain." Armand's fist slammed into the metal wall beside Benjamin's head with enough force to dent it. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space. A violent punctuation mark that made Benjamin flinch so hard he nearly collapsed. "Her uncle sold her to you," Armand said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that was somehow more terrifying than the shout Benjamin expected. "Miguel Garcia sold his blind niece for $15,000. You told her she was going to a job at a nonprofit. You showed her fake paperwork in Braille. You planned to traffic her to a house outside Kansas City where you keep other women. And you used my roots, my protection, my empire to do it." Benjamin was shaking now, full body tremors that made him look like he was freezing to death. "Boss, it's just business. Special cargo. You said to maximize the roots, to find profitable opportunities. I thought..." "You thought what?" Armand's voice dropped to absolute zero, colder than death, harder than stone. "I said contraband. I said goods, counterfeit merchandise, electronics, money, things. I never said people. I never said women. I never said blind girls sold by their own goddamn family. But the money," Benjamin's voice cracked. "The profits were incredible. 50, 60,000 per shipment. I thought you'd be pleased. I thought..." "You thought I wouldn't notice?" Armand leaned in close enough that Benjamin could feel his breath. "You thought I wouldn't find out? Or did you just think I wouldn't care?" Benjamin's mouth worked soundlessly. His eyes darted toward the curtain, toward escape that didn't exist, toward help that would never come. Armand pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness. He opened the recording app, hit the red button, held the phone up where Benjamin could see it clearly. "Here's what's going to happen," Armand said with deadly calm. "You're going to tell me everything. Every woman, every route, every buyer, every single person involved in your operation. You're going to give me names, locations, dates. You're going to tell me where the women are now. And you're going to do it on camera, clearly, with no ambiguity. Benjamin's face crumpled. Boss, please. Or, Armand continued as if Benjamin hadn't spoken. I open that emergency door right now, and you exit at 35,000 feet. The cabin will depressurize. Oxygen masks will drop. People will panic. And you'll be gone before anyone even understands what happened. And trust me, Benjamin, no one on this plane will stop me. Do you know why? Benjamin shook his head mutely. Because I'm Armand Piero. And you? You're just a man who made the fatal mistake of getting caught. Benjamin broke. Completely, utterly, like a dam giving way under too much pressure. The confession poured out between sobs, between desperate gasps for air, between the wreckage of a man who'd thought himself untouchable and just learned otherwise. 18 months. An operation that started small. One woman, vulnerable, undocumented, easy to move. Then another, building a network like a cancer growing through Armand's legitimate shipping routes. 14 women total, targeted for their vulnerabilities, disabilities like Sarah's blindness, poverty that made promises of legitimate work believable, immigration status that made going to authorities dangerous, women who wouldn't be missed, or wouldn't be believed, or wouldn't be able to identify their captors, routes through Armand's shipping fronts, using the protection of his name without his knowledge, money laundered through accounts connected to the organization, buyers in 3 states, Kansas City, Denver, Houston. Some women sold outright, others kept in houses, working off fictional debts that would never be paid. Sarah was supposed to be the 15th, the latest acquisition, already paid for by Miguel Garcia's betrayal. When Benjamin finished, his face was wet with tears and snot and the complete destruction of everything he'd thought he was. Armand stared at him for a long, silent moment. The phone was still recording, every word, every sob, every confession. And you used my empire? Armand's voice was dead calm now, almost conversational. My money? My protection? My name? Benjamin nodded, tears streaming down his face. I thought you knew. I thought that's what you meant by special routes. You thought wrong. Armand's laugh was cold, empty, devoid of any human warmth. You know what the funny thing is, Benjamin? If you'd chosen literally any other flight, literally any other day, you might have gotten away with it. Maybe not forever, but longer. Long enough. He leaned in close. But you got on my flight. You sat 3 rows in front of me, with my victim. A blind girl performing the rescue signal, praying someone would see, and I watched the whole thing. Armand pulled out the plane's emergency communication system, the same system used to contact ground control in emergencies. He dialed a number from memory, a number he'd never thought he'd actually use. It rang twice. Wilson. The voice on the other end was gruff, suspicious. FBI Special Agent Marcus Wilson, Organized Crime Division, a man who'd been trying to build a case against Armand for 6 years. Wilson. It's Piero. Silence. Then. This better not be a joke. Flight 447. Landing at Kansas City International in 90 minutes. I'm sending you a recorded confession via encrypted email right now. Trafficking. 14 confirmed victims. 1 attempted. My capo. My roots. My responsibility. Armand's voice was mechanical, emotionless. Have a team waiting on the tarmac. Federal custody. And Wilson? Make sure he goes to general population. Make sure every single inmate knows exactly what he did. More silence. Then Wilson's voice, careful. You're turning in your own man? He's not my man anymore. He never was. I just didn't know it until today. Armand ended the call and turned back to Benjamin, who looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words his brain couldn't quite process. You're turning me in? Benjamin's voice was a broken whisper, hoarse with disbelief. You're Armand Piero. You don't work with feds. You don't cooperate. You don't. Armand leaned close, his voice a razor cutting through Benjamin's reality. I do now. Congratulations. You accomplished something 6 years of federal investigation couldn't. You made me pick a side. He smiled. And it was the cruelest expression Benjamin had ever seen. And here's the beautiful part: every second you spend in prison, every night you lie awake in your cell, wondering if today's the day the other inmates figure out what you did. Every moment of fear and pain and suffering, you'll know it's because you got on the wrong flight. Because I was there. Because I saw. Because Sarah Garcia made a signal you thought no one would understand. Armand straightened, adjusting his jacket with the calm precision of a man who'd just concluded a successful business meeting. "Sleep light, Benjamin. The general population doesn't treat people like you kindly, and I'm going to make absolutely certain they know every detail. They're going to eat you alive." Benjamin slumped against the beverage cart, broken, destroyed, the future unfolding before him in an endless nightmare of concrete and bars, and violent justice from men who had daughters, sisters, mothers. Armand pulled back the curtain and walked away without looking back, leaving Benjamin to contemplate the very specific kind of hell that awaited him on the ground. The plane touched down at Kansas City International, with the kind of smooth landing that under normal circumstances would have prompted polite applause from grateful passengers. Instead, the cabin was thick with confused tension as federal agents boarded before anyone could unbuckle their seatbelts, before the overhead bin chime could even sound, before normalcy could pretend everything was fine. Benjamin was escorted off in handcuffs, his face destroyed by terror, his expensive designer suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. He looked back once as agents flanked him down the aisle, looked directly at where Armand sat in 6A, calm and untouched, and the expression on Benjamin's face was something Armand would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not betrayal, just the hollow, empty realization that he'd lost everything because he'd gotten on the wrong flight with the wrong girl in front of the wrong man. Other passengers craned their necks, whispered frantically to each other, pulled out phones to record. A businessman 2 rows up muttered something about terrorists. An elderly woman clutched her husband's arm. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, requesting everyone remain seated, remain calm. Everything was under control. Sarah was met at the door by victim services coordinators, 2 women and 1 man, all wearing crisis counselor identification badges, all moving with the careful gentleness of people trained to handle trauma. Armand watched from his seat as they wrapped Sarah in a blanket despite the temperate cabin, offered her water, spoke to her in low, soothing tones. Claire and Monica stayed close, their hands on Sarah's shoulders, anchoring her to something solid while her world continued to tilt. Sarah's face was pale, drawn, exhausted, but when the crisis counselor asked if she needed medical attention, she shook her head. I need to know he can't get to me." "That he can't, the counselor said firmly. "He's in federal custody. He will never be able to hurt you again." Armand stood when the agents finally allowed first-class passengers to deplane. He moved through the jetway with the crowd, anonymous in his expensive suit, just another businessman concluding another trip. But at the gate, Special Agent Marcus Wilson was waiting, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. "Piero." Wilson's voice was quiet, meant only for Armand's ears. "Wilson." They moved away from the crowd, toward an empty gate area where CNN played silently on overhead monitors. Wilson studied Armand with the intensity of a man who'd spent 6 years building a profile, trying to understand the inner workings of a criminal empire, and had just watched that entire profile get rewritten. "This doesn't make us friends," Wilson said finally. Armand's voice was flat, emotionless. "I know, but it makes us useful to each other. I have 13 more names for you." Women. Benjamin moved. "Current locations if I can find them. Last known locations if I can't. You'll need search warrants, coordination with local PD in 3 states. I'll provide everything I have." Wilson's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I enabled this. I didn't know, I would never have knowingly, but ignorance isn't innocence. I gave Benjamin the roots, the protection, the resources. I looked away when I should have been watching closer. This is my ledger to clear." "Speaking of ledgers," Wilson said slowly, "I have an address for you to add to that list. Miguel Garcia, Sarah's uncle, the man who sold her." Armand's jaw tightened. 943 Maple Street, apartment 2B, Albuquerque, New Mexico. "I already sent you the file. Charge him with human trafficking. And Wilson, make sure he understands exactly what he did. Make sure he knows his niece survived, and that's the only reason he's breathing." Wilson nodded slowly. "This doesn't clear your ledger, Piero. Not even close." Armand's laugh was bitter, empty. "I know, but it's a start." Over the following 6 months, Armand became something he'd never been before, a ghost who hunted other monsters. He used his criminal network not to expand his empire, but to feed federal investigators every detail of Benjamin's operation, every contact, every location, every transaction logged in encrypted files Benjamin thought were secure. 13 women were located and rescued. some in houses scattered across Kansas City and Denver, some already sold to buyers who thought money made them untouchable until federal agents kicked down doors at dawn. Some were American citizens, some were undocumented. All were terrified, traumatized, and finally free. The 14th woman, a girl named Isabella Rodriguez who'd disappeared 11 months prior, was identified posthumously. She'd been found dead in a Denver apartment 3 months ago, listed as a Jane Doe overdose. Case closed. Armand made sure her family in Mexico received the truth, received closure, received enough money to bring her body home. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Miguel Garcia was arrested in his Albuquerque apartment on a Tuesday morning, still in his bathrobe, coffee in hand, probably wondering why his niece hadn't called to thank him for the opportunity he'd arranged. He received 25 years for human trafficking and conspiracy. Sarah never spoke to him again. Never wrote, never visited. She told Armand during one of their few conversations that Miguel was dead to her the moment he shook Benjamin's hand and accepted the money. Armand anonymously funded Sarah's trauma therapy through a nonprofit that specialized in trafficking survivors. Twice weekly sessions with a psychologist who understood blindness, who understood betrayal, who understood that healing wasn't linear. He relocated Sarah to a secure apartment in a building with state-of-the-art accessibility features, textured pathways, audio elevators, a community of residents who looked out for each other. He paid for Hope, a golden retriever service dog who became Sarah's constant companion, her anchor, her proof that trust could be rebuilt. He upgraded the building's security system, covered all her living expenses, made sure she never had to worry about money, about safety, about anything except healing and moving forward. She enrolled in a university program for social work, determined to help other survivors, to be for someone else what Armand had been for her, the person who saw when no one else was looking. Benjamin's trial was swift and devastating. The recorded confession was played in court, his voice, his words, his complete admission of guilt. His defense attorney tried to argue coercion, tried to claim Armand had threatened him into confessing. But the jury heard Benjamin's detailed knowledge of routes, names, locations, transactions. They saw the evidence of 18 months of systematic exploitation. They deliberated for 90 minutes and returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. 45 years in federal prison. Within 4 months, Armand heard through prison contacts that Benjamin had been found in the yard with severe injuries. Broken ribs, shattered jaw, the kind of injuries that said other inmates had learned what he did and delivered their own justice. Benjamin spent the rest of his sentence in protective custody, terrified and broken, exactly as Armand had promised. 6 months after the flight, Armand received an invitation to a National Aviation Safety Summit in Chicago. He didn't RSVP, didn't call, didn't confirm attendance. He simply showed up and sat anonymously in the back row of a massive conference hall filled with flight attendants, airline security personnel, and safety coordinators from every major carrier. Sarah took the stage with Hope beside her, and Armand's breath caught in his throat. She was radiant, transformed. She wore professional clothes, a navy blazer, white blouse, slacks that fit properly, shoes that weren't worn at the heels. Her dark hair was styled. She moved with confidence, her hand resting lightly on Hope's harness, her chin up, her shoulders back. She looked like someone who'd reclaimed herself from the wreckage. She spoke with authority, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the hundreds of attendants watching her. She taught them the rescue signal thumb tucked under 4 fingers, demonstrating it slowly, deliberately, the same way she'd performed it on Flight 447, when she couldn't see if anyone was watching. She told her story, not all of it. The details were too raw, too personal, but enough. She described the blind terror of being sold by family, the calculated hope of making the signal, the impossible miracle that someone saw. And then she said the words that cracked Armand's chest wide open, that broke through 20 years of carefully constructed emotional armor, that made him understand exactly what he'd been missing his entire life. Someone saw me when I couldn't see myself. Someone brave enough looked. And because of that, I'm here. And because of that, 13 other women got to go home. And because of that, a monster who thought he was untouchable learned he wasn't. Her voice strengthened, filled the massive hall. The rescue signal only works if someone is watching. If someone cares enough to look. I'm standing here today because one person refused to look away. Armand's vision blurred. His hands shook where they gripped the armrests. He stood quietly, carefully, and slipped out of the back of the hall, before anyone could notice the tears streaming down his face, before anyone could see the way his carefully constructed mask had finally, completely shattered. 1 week later, Armand visited Sarah privately at her apartment. Hope greeted him first, tail wagging, pressing her nose into his hand with the uncomplicated affection only dogs possessed. Sarah stood in her small living room, and somehow, impossibly, she smiled when he entered. "I knew it was you," she said softly. "At the summit. I felt someone leave right after I spoke. And I knew." Armand's throat tightened. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. The truth. All of it." She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He told her everything. The empire he ran, the money he made, the lines he'd drawn that turned out to be meaningless, the way Benjamin had used his roots, his protection, his implicit permission to operate in shadows Armand had created. "I'm not a good man," he said, his voice cracking. "The empire I run, it enabled what happened to you. I can't undo that. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to protect people like you." Sarah's hand found his across the small coffee table. Her grip was strong, steady. "Then start today. Keep going, one day at a time." Armand's voice was barely a whisper. "Your uncle is exactly where he belongs," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "And I've forgiven him. Not for him, but for me. So I can move forward without carrying that weight." Armand stared at her. This blind girl who'd been betrayed by blood and still found the strength to forgive. And he realized he was looking at someone stronger than he'd ever be. "You saved me, Armand," Sarah said softly. "Now save yourself." Armand returned to his world, but everything had changed. He began systematically dismantling the parts of his empire that enabled exploitation. He protected vulnerable people his organization encountered. He fed information to Agent Wilson when it mattered, when it could save someone, when it could stop another Benjamin before they started. He became a ghost who hunted monsters in the shadows, using the same skills that built an empire to tear down the worst parts of it. Months later, Armand sat in his car outside Sarah's university, engine idling, watching through the large ground floor windows as she led a support group for trafficking survivors. 12 women sat in a circle, their faces showing various stages of healing. Sarah stood at the front with Hope beside her, teaching them the rescue signal, empowering them with the knowledge that saved her life. Armand pulled out the small note Sarah had given him during his visit, a piece of paper with braille dots raised on the surface. He'd had someone translate it once, but he'd also learned to read it himself, tracing the dots the way she did, feeling the words with his fingertips. "Thank you for seeing." He touched the words gently, reverently, like they were sacred text. He murmured his vow into the empty car, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll never stop looking, kid. I'll never stop seeing. Never." He started the engine and drove back into his dark world. But now he carried a light that couldn't be extinguished. The blind girl who couldn't see had saved the Mafia Boss who finally refused to look away. And every day, he chose to keep seeing. One person at a time, one intervention at a time, one life at a time. It would never clear his ledger, but it was a start. Kindly drop a comment. Rate this story from 1 to 10, and let me know if you want a part 2. Please help me build a community of people spreading stories that matter by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.